This is a presentation on bias and its impact created for D265, Critical Thinking. We will be working through concepts from Section 3, 1 through 4. Let's begin by describing bias in general. Biases are tendencies to have opinions that gravitate in a certain direction based on desires and mental shortcuts instead of clear and careful thought. Bias is pretty pervasive in the everyday formation of opinions, and it's no disaster to have a bias, but it's important to be ready to see when one is biased about something, and to know a little bit about how to counteract that bias when it's about something important. In the following slides, we'll talk about several specific types of bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to accept evidence that agrees with what you already think and to reject evidence that disagrees with what you already think. So, for example, if I run a small business and improve that quality, but I reject the study simply because I disagree, I am engaging in confirmation bias. Instead, I should carefully look into the study's data and how its authors reach its conclusions to see whether I should change my mind. Here are some questions you can ask yourself as you think about how often confirmation bias affects your thinking. In particular, it's a good idea to frequently revisit question 3 so that you are explicitly deciding how to form your beliefs instead of simply believing whatever passes through your mind and feels right in the moment. In the next slides, we will talk about cognitive biases. These are systemic mistakes, meaning they can affect almost all our decision-making processes. A-leaf is a word that was created by philosophers to describe attitudes we have that are like beliefs, but not conscious or only half conscious, and not necessarily ideas we would endorse if we thought about them. In addition to the example described on your screen, here's another example. I happen to know, based on everything I've read and been told by owners, that German Shepherd dogs are very friendly and affectionate towards children. Yet, it remains the case that when I see a German Shepherd, I shrink away and assume it wants to bite me. I know this isn't true, but I have an A-leaf, a reflexive attitude that they are dangerous. It's important for us to distinguish our A-leaves from our B-leaves, and to try to be thoughtful about when our A-leaves are trustworthy and when they are not. Sometimes a person or situation feels like it's an example of something just based on a few basic similarities. Someone in a ski mask in a bank we may automatically assume is a bank robber. A small creature with an exoskeleton we may assume is an insect, and so on. These represent examples of the representativeness heuristic, making an assumption that a situation belongs to some category based on a few salient features that feel typical to us of that category. Of course, not every small creature with an exoskeleton is an insect. Some are spiders, some are centipedes, and so on. And of course, not everyone in a bank with a ski mask is a bank robber. So we must be careful not to immediately assume, just based on a few similarities to a certain type of situation, that we are definitely in that kind of situation. Anchoring bias occurs when we are, so to speak, stuck on our first impression of something. In the example you see on your screen, the question triggers an anchoring bias by mentioning the number 3 million. This gives you an initial impression of Wyoming's population, such that even if you know it has the lowest population in the United States, you're still likely to guess a number in the millions. The correct answer, by the way, is about 500,000. The availability heuristic is the process of drawing conclusions based on the most easily available information. Of course, drawing good conclusions often requires looking for less easily available information. And this means the availability heuristic can lead to a bias towards simplistic conclusions that lack depth or analysis of insight, or analysis or insight that lack depth of analysis or insight. You may have heard people say that the simplest answer is often the best one. Unfortunately, that is often untrue. Often the simplest answer is the one that makes us feel like we've understood without actually giving us any understanding. Selection bias is also often called hasty generalization. It occurs when we draw a conclusion about a larger group based on a few skewed examples from that group. There's nothing inherently wrong with drawing conclusions about groups based on some examples from that group. I don't need to ask every single adult in the US what they think about speed limit laws before I can draw any conclusions. I can draw good conclusions if I make sure simply to ask a large enough number of adults from a variety of locations and demographics about their opinion. This is the basis of the science behind polls and surveys and often leads to accurate conclusions. The problems happen when we don't get information from a variety of locations and demographics and don't get a large number of examples. If I only ask a few 20-year-olds in Indianapolis about their opinion of speed limit laws, I can't safely draw conclusions from that about adults' opinions throughout the entire US. To do so would be an example of selection bias. Just as you can see in the example on your screen, we can often report the same fact in two different ways to create two different effects in our audience. As we mentioned towards the beginning of this presentation, bias is pretty pervasive in our thinking, and it would be impossible to root out every single bit of bias that we suffer from. This is why it's important to be ready to spot biases in our own thinking when we're thinking about something important. And to do that, it helps to make a habit of periodically slowing down. Bias happens when we reflectively follow our first or quickest impressions. We can counteract its influence by stopping and asking questions like, where am I getting my information from? How do I know these information sources are trustworthy? What makes an information source trustworthy? Am I only calling them trustworthy when I like what they say? What reasoning am I using to get from that information to my conclusions? Am I making careful, strong, or valid inferences like the ones I'm learning about in this course? Or am I making quick, heuristic-led inferences like the ones I'm learning about in this slideshow? It often helps to talk these things through with someone who either disagrees with you or has a knack for keeping people intellectually honest, asking piercing but constructive questions to help you think through your own thought processes. Obviously, no one can do this for every decision they make or opinion they form. In fact, probably no one can do this for most of their day-to-day decisions and opinions. But when the matter is important, it's worth getting right. As critical thinking instructors, we are very happy to help with this. Thank you for listening.